Half of Africa just joined the most powerful economic bloc on Earth, and Washington is panicking. Nigeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia just made a move that could change everything about how money works. These three countries, representing almost 500 million people, have joined or partnered with BRICS, a group of nations that's quietly building an alternative to the dollar-dominated financial system that's ruled the world for 80 years. This isn't just about trade deals or diplomatic handshakes. This is about who gets to control the money that fuels global commerce, who decides which currencies matter, and whether the United States can keep using the dollar as a weapon. And if you think this doesn't affect you, think again, because when the world's reserve currency starts losing its grip, everything from gas prices to your grocery bill gets dragged into the chaos. Let me take you back to 1944. Because none of this makes sense without understanding how we got here. After World War II, representatives from 44 countries met in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. They created a system where every major currency in the world was pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. You could literally walk into the US Federal Reserve with dollars and exchange them for gold at a fixed rate. This gave America enormous power, because if every country needed dollars to trade with each other, then America controlled the flow of global commerce. In 1971, President Nixon ended the gold standard. The dollar was no longer backed by anything physical. It was backed by trust, by the size of the American economy, and by the fact that everyone was already using it. But here's the kicker. The system stayed in place. Oil was still priced in dollars. International loans were issued in dollars. Countries kept their reserves in dollars. This meant that even when America ran massive deficits and printed money like crazy, the rest of the world had to keep buying dollars just to participate in the global economy. For decades, African countries have been trapped in this system. Nigeria sells oil and gets paid in dollars. Egypt imports wheat and pays in dollars. Ethiopia buys medicine and pays in dollars. Even when these countries trade with each other, they often have to convert their local currencies into dollars first, because their own currencies aren't trusted or accepted internationally. Every time they do this, they lose money on conversion fees, exchange rate fluctuations, and the simple fact that they're forced to hold a currency they don't control. And when the US raises interest rates, which it did aggressively in 2022 and 2023, African currencies collapse. The dollar gets stronger, their debts get more expensive, and they have to spend more of their national budgets just servicing loans they took out years ago. In 2024 alone, African nations spent an estimated $70 billion on debt servicing, money that could have gone to schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. This is where BRICS comes in. BRICS started in 2009 as an informal club of 4 countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. South Africa joined in 2010, making it BRICS instead of BRIC. For years, it was mostly talk. Annual summits, joint statements, vague promises of cooperation. But something shifted in the last few years, especially after Russia invaded Ukraine and the West hit Moscow with the most aggressive sanctions in modern history. Russia got kicked out of SWIFT, the international payment system that banks use to send money across borders. Suddenly, Russia couldn't use dollars for trade anymore, and it needed alternatives fast. China, which has its own issues with the US over Taiwan, technology sanctions, and trade wars, saw an opportunity. Together, they started pushing for something that had been theoretical for years: a way to bypass the dollar entirely. At the BRICS summit in Johannesburg in August 2023, the bloc made a huge announcement. 6 new countries were invited to join: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. This wasn't random. These countries represented key resources, huge populations, and strategic locations. Egypt controls the Suez Canal, one of the most important trade routes on Earth. Ethiopia is the second most populous country in Africa. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are oil powerhouses. Iran, despite being under heavy sanctions, has massive oil and gas reserves. Argentina backed out after electing a pro-Western president, and Saudi Arabia is still deciding. But the other 4 officially joined in January 2024. Then, in October 2024 at the BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, the bloc went even further. 13 more countries were invited as partner states, including Nigeria, Algeria, and Uganda from Africa. Nigeria accepted in January 2025, becoming the 6th most populous country on Earth to align with BRICS. So what does BRICS actually offer? It's not just about membership in a club. The real power comes from three things: the new development bank, local currency trade, and the BRICS bridge payment system. The new development bank, also called the BRICS Bank, was created in 2014. It's designed to be an alternative to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which have been controlled by Western countries since World War II. The IMF gives loans, but they come with brutal conditions. They force countries to cut government spending, privatize public services, and open their markets to foreign investors. The BRICS Bank doesn't do that. It lends money for infrastructure projects like roads, power plants, and ports, and it does so in local currencies, not dollars. By 2024, the bank had approved over $32 billion for 96 projects. For African countries that have been burned by IMF loans before, this is a lifeline. Then there's local currency trade. Traditionally, if Nigeria wants to buy machinery from China, it has to convert naira into dollars, send those to China, and then China converts the dollars into yuan. This process is expensive, slow, and puts both countries at the mercy of dollar exchange rates. BRICS countries are now bypassing the dollar completely. China and Russia now conduct over 90% of their trade in yuan and rubles. Brazil and China signed a currency swap agreement in 2023, allowing direct trade in yuan and reals. India is buying Russian oil in rupees. Egypt signed a $2.5 billion currency swap deal with China in late 2024. Meaning Egyptian businesses can now buy Chinese goods using yuan instead of dollars. This doesn't eliminate the dollar overnight, but it chips away at its dominance, transaction by transaction. The BRICS bridge payment system is the big one. SWIFT, the global banking network, is controlled by Western countries and headquartered in Belgium. When the US wanted to punish Russia, it kicked them out of SWIFT, effectively cutting them off from the global financial system. BRICS is building its own version called BRICS Bridge, which would let member countries transfer money directly to each other using digital currencies, blockchain technology, and local currencies. It launched in 2024, and by mid-2025, pilot programs were running between China, Russia, India, South Africa, and Egypt. If this system works, it could allow billions of people to trade, send money, and do business without ever touching a dollar. Now, why does this terrify the West? Because the dollar's dominance isn't just about economics, it's about power. When most of the world uses dollars, America can print money without facing the same inflation pressure other countries would. It can run massive budget deficits because there's always demand for dollars overseas. And most importantly, it can impose sanctions that actually hurt. When the US freezes someone's dollar assets or cuts them off from SWIFT, that's devastating, because there's no real alternative. But if BRICS creates a functioning alternative, those sanctions lose their bite. Russia has already proven this. Despite being hit with more sanctions than any country in history, its economy only shrank by 2.1% in 2022 and actually grew in 2023 and 2024, largely because China, India, and other countries kept trading with them using non-dollar currencies. For Africa, this shift is massive. Nigeria, the largest economy in Africa, saw foreign investments from BRICS countries jump by 189% in the first half of 2024 alone, totaling over $1 billion. These investments aren't going into oil extraction like Western companies used to do. They're going into technology, data centers, broadband infrastructure, and semiconductor manufacturing. China is building a high-speed rail network across East Africa. India is Nigeria's biggest pharmaceutical supplier and is now exploring local currency trade. The UAE, which joined BRICS in 2024, has become a major investor in African tech startups and green energy projects. Egypt, which has been dealing with chronic dollar shortages, can now import Chinese goods using yuan from its currency swap deal, easing pressure on its foreign reserves. Ethiopia, which has a trade deficit of over $10 billion and has been desperate for foreign currency, is exploring similar deals with India and China. But here's where it gets complicated. Just because BRICS offers an alternative doesn't mean it's better. Let's be honest about what's happening here. Russia isn't promoting trade in local currencies because it believes in African sovereignty. It's doing it because it got cut off from the dollar and desperately needs alternatives. China isn't building infrastructure in Africa out of charity. It's securing access to resources, creating markets for Chinese goods, and expanding its political influence. When China lends money for a port or a highway, and that country can't pay it back, China ends up controlling that infrastructure. This has already happened in Sri Lanka, where China took over the Hambantota port after the country defaulted on its loans. The same pattern is starting to appear in parts of Africa. And then there's the currency question. BRICS has been talking about creating a common currency for years, but it's not happening anytime soon. At the 2024 BRICS summit in Kazan, Russian President Vladimir Putin literally held up what looked like a prototype BRICS banknote for the cameras, generating massive headlines. But days later, he backtracked, saying Russia isn't trying to abandon the dollar and that a common BRICS currency is premature, because it's incredibly difficult to create a unified currency when your member countries have completely different economies, political systems, and interests. Brazil is a democracy with relatively low inflation. Russia is an autocracy under severe sanctions with a war economy. China has strict capital controls and a currency that's not freely convertible. India refuses to give up the rupee's sovereignty. South Africa has a weak economy struggling with electricity blackouts and corruption. How do you create one currency for all of that? You don't, at least not yet. What's more realistic is a basket currency, similar to how the IMF has special drawing rights, which is a weighted average of several major currencies. BRICS could create a digital settlement unit backed by gold or a mix of member currencies, used specifically for trade between BRICS countries. This wouldn't replace national currencies, but it would reduce dollar dependence. Some analysts think this could happen by 2027 or 2028, but even that's optimistic. The bigger threat to the dollar isn't a new BRICS currency. It's the slow, steady increase in trade, conducted in local currencies, the growing use of alternative payment systems, and the simple fact that more and more countries are realizing they don't need dollars for everything. Donald Trump has made it clear he's not going to sit back and watch this happen. During his 2024 campaign, he threatened to impose 100% tariffs on any country that moves away from the dollar. After he returned to office in January 2025, he escalated those threats. In August 2025, the US imposed 30% tariffs on South African imports. Trump has specifically called out BRICS, warning that any attempt to undermine the dollar will face severe economic retaliation. Brazil's President Lula responded by saying BRICS is committed to ending dollar dominance no matter what. This back and forth is only pushing more countries toward BRICS. When the US threatens sanctions and tariffs, it reminds everyone why they want alternatives in the first place. But here's the thing Trump and his advisors don't seem to fully grasp. This isn't about BRICS versus America. It's about the world changing. In 2016, BRICS countries overtook the G7 in combined GDP when measured by purchasing power parity, which accounts for what money can actually buy in each country. Today, BRICS accounts for 46% of global GDP and 55% of the world's population when you include partners. The US and Europe's share of the global economy has been shrinking for 2 decades. This isn't because Western countries are failing, it's because billions of people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are finally getting wealthier, building industries, and demanding a seat at the table. The dollar dominance was always going to face pressure as the rest of the world caught up economically. That said, reports of the dollar's death are massively exaggerated. As of 2024, the dollar is still used in almost 90% of all foreign exchange transactions and 48% of SWIFT payments. Central banks around the world hold 59% of their foreign reserves in dollars, down from 85% in the 1970s, but still dominant. The euro accounts for about 20%, the yuan for less than 5%. No other currency comes close. The dollar remains the most liquid, most trusted, most stable currency in the world. Businesses prefer it because it's easy to use, widely accepted, and backed by the largest economy and military on Earth. The problem for the US isn't that the dollar will collapse overnight. It's that every percentage point of market share it loses makes American power slightly weaker. When trade shifts from dollars to yuan, rubles, or rupees, America loses leverage. When countries build reserves in other currencies, they become less vulnerable to US sanctions. This is a slow erosion, not a sudden cliff. And for Africa, the real question is whether this shift actually leads to independence or just a different kind of dependence. Nigerian economist Stephen Oniawu put it well. Joining BRICS gives African countries more options, but only if they use those options wisely. Nigeria could attract Chinese investment in technology and infrastructure, but it needs to make sure those deals benefit ordinary Nigerians, not just elites. Egypt could reduce its dollar dependency, but it also needs to fix its domestic economy, because no amount of yuan is going to solve corruption, inflation, or bad governance. Ethiopia could access Indian pharmaceuticals at lower prices, but it still needs to stabilize its currency and address its internal conflicts. The tragedy is that African countries deserve better than what they've gotten from the West, but BRICS isn't necessarily offering something fundamentally different, just a different master. When France controlled West Africa through the CFA franc, that was neo-colonialism. When China builds a port in East Africa and ends up owning it because the loan couldn't be repaid, what is that? The language is different, the players are different, but the power dynamic risks being the same. Rich countries with capital and technology, poor countries with resources and labor, and deals that benefit the powerful more than the people. What makes this moment different, though, is that African countries now have leverage they didn't have before. When there were only two options, the US or Europe, African leaders had to accept whatever terms were offered. Now there are more players: China, India, Russia, Turkey, the UAE, even Gulf states looking for investment opportunities. This competition should theoretically give African countries better deals, more favorable loan terms, fewer conditions attached to aid. But only if African leaders negotiate from a position of strength, build transparent institutions, and prioritize their people's interests over personal enrichment. Some African countries are getting this right. South Africa, despite its internal problems, is testing the BRICS bridge payment system and positioning itself as a financial hub for the continent. Kenya, though not a BRICS member, has been carefully balancing relationships with China, the US, and Europe, playing them off each other to get the best infrastructure deals. Botswana has managed its diamond wealth carefully for decades, avoiding the resource curse that's plagued so many African nations. These examples show it's possible to navigate this new multipolar world without getting trapped in debt or dependency, but others are getting it wrong. Some governments are taking massive loans from China for projects that don't make economic sense, just because the money is available, and some of it can be siphoned off by corrupt officials. Some are signing agreements that give foreign companies access to resources at below market rates. Some are so desperate for foreign currency that they'll accept any deal no matter how lopsided. The BRICS expansion gives these countries more options, but options aren't the same as solutions. Bad decisions with Chinese money are still bad decisions. Here's what we're really watching: the end of a world order that's been in place since 1945, where America and Europe made the rules and everyone else had to follow them. That order brought stability, but it also brought exploitation, debt traps disguised as development aid, and a financial system rigged to benefit the already powerful. BRICS isn't perfect, and it might not even succeed. Its members disagree on almost everything except their frustration with Western dominance. China and India have border disputes. Russia is a pariah state. Brazil swings between left and right-wing governments every few years. These aren't natural allies, but they don't need to be. They just need to cooperate enough to create alternatives, and that's exactly what they're doing. For Africa, this is the biggest opportunity in a generation, but it's also incredibly dangerous. Get it right, and African countries could finally break free from cycles of debt and dependency, build their own industries, trade on their own terms, and accumulate wealth that stays on the continent. Get it wrong, and they'll just trade one form of neo-colonialism for another, this time with Beijing or Moscow pulling the strings instead of Washington or Paris. The question isn't whether Africa should engage with BRICS. It's how they engage, what terms they demand, and whether they have the political will to put their people's interests first. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: neither the West nor BRICS really cares about African development for its own sake. They care about resources, markets, and geopolitical influence. The West wants to contain China. China wants to secure supply chains and expand its economic reach. Russia wants allies who won't enforce Western sanctions. Everyone is playing a game, and Africa is the board. The only way African countries win is if they stop being the board and start being players, setting their own terms, building their own institutions, and refusing to be pawns in someone else's power struggle. So when you see headlines about Africa joining BRICS, or the dollar losing control, or a new world order emerging, understand what's really happening. This isn't good guys versus bad guys. This is a bunch of powerful countries jockeying for position in a world that's rapidly changing, and African nations trying to figure out how to use that chaos to their advantage. The dollar will remain important for years, maybe decades, but its monopoly is ending. And that's going to reshape everything from how wars are fought to how poor countries borrow money to whether your phone costs $500 or $1,000, because all of that is connected to who controls the global financial system.